workshop. Are we in compliance with the Freedom of Information Act?
Yes, sir, we are.
Would you do the roll call, please?
Yes, sir, I will. Mayor McCann.
Here.
Mr. Harkins.
Here.
Mr. Brown.
Here.
Mr. Ames.
Here.
Mrs. Becker.
Here.
Mr. Lennox.
Here.
And Mr. Stanford.
Here.
All present, sir.
Could you please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge
allegiance to the flag of
the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands,
one
one
nation,
nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Need an approval of the agenda.
Move for approval of the agenda.
Second. All in favor, please raise your right hand. Thank you very much. Today we're going to have a discussion on the Hilton Island redistricting process by Frank Rainwater, Executive Director of the South Carolina Revenue and Fiscal Affairs. There will be no vote taken after this meeting. The questions of our next steps after the meeting will be done by Mr. Gruber. I'd appreciate if everybody can hold their questions till the end because it's a rather lengthy presentation. With that, Frank, good morning. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Members of council, it's a pleasure to be here and to be assisting the town of Hilton Head on its redistricting efforts. Let me introduce the others in the room with me. Right behind me is Victor Frontroff. He's our lead map maker. Behind Victor is Mary Catherine Miller. She's one of our staff research and attorney who's been helping us. And then Adam DeMars over here is one of our GIS specialists. And this is just part of the team. We have numerous other individuals and especially statisticians helping pull this information together for you. So I'm happy to answer any questions you have during or after, but I'm going to walk through two parts of this for you and for the public. And about what the redistricting process is, and then about the report we just provided you about some of the details, what we're seeing about the town of Hilton Head. So to begin with, this process is a little bit different. I don't know how many members on council were here 10 years ago when you did redistricting, but due to some Supreme Court decisions, the process has changed. We think there's a lot more emphasis on transparency and having more information up front in deciding these issues. The biggest change from last time is that you are no longer under the under pre-clearance by the Department of Justice. Last time when you adopted a plan, it had to be submitted to the Department of Justice and they had to approve the plan or basically pre-clear it for the elections. Based on some recent Supreme Court decisions, South Carolina no longer falls under that requirement. So there's a much more of an emphasis upon council to make sure they understand the risk involved in to do this. When you were under pre-clearance, it was good and bad. It was bad because you had somebody else looking over your shoulder and having to comment on your plan. But it was good in the way that if you had pre-clearance, it kind of gave you a level of protection there. If somebody wanted to sue you or challenge you, you could say, well, the Department of Justice pre-cleared it. And it was a little bit higher burden for them to overcome. That is no longer the case. And part of what we want to emphasize with you is the risk that we see. It's constitutional, statutory, and traditional principles here of redistricting that council has to be aware of. The bottom line is, and what we're going to emphasize for you, is that council is going to have to balance a number of factors here and to come up with a plan that fits them. What's good for the town of Hilton Head may be different than Beaufort County. It may be different than a neighboring city. It depends on that local flavor and that local input that's important to you, and I'm going to highlight that for you. After this meeting, at some point, council will need to adopt an ordinance outlining the basic principles or goals that you have. I believe at the municipal level, it takes 2 readings. The counties usually take 3 readings, but this will take a couple of readings. Council has the option to amend the plan as you go forward, or you could wait and have hearings and then have a final plan and start moving the final plan. So you have some options there. So to begin with, let's just talk about redistricting in general. And I'm going to start with page 2 of our report, if you have seen that, or when you get to that report. The basic principle of redistricting is maintaining one person, one vote. And what the courts mean by that, and what we try to explain by that, is you're trying to make sure the number of people in your district are equal or thereabouts, closely equal to the number of people to the adjoining district. By making sure they're equal, then everybody's voice weighs the same. Let me use a general example, simple example. If you have a district with 100 people in it, and the adjoining district has 200 people in it, that district with only 100 people, their voices have a greater say because it only takes 100 people to elect a council member to have their have their voice represented on council. If you were in a district with 200 people, it takes twice as many people to elect that. And in effect, your voice weighs half as much as somebody in that 100-person district. So the intent of redistricting is, after the census comes out, to equalize that. In essence, the ideal would be to have 150 people in each district. That's the basic principle the court has determined as part of the 14th Amendment, part of the Equal Protection Clause, that everybody's voice has about an equal say in their governing process. The second thing we'll talk about is the Voting Rights Act. Under the 14th Amendment, I should add that under the 14th Amendment, the courts have also said you cannot use race as a predominant factor when you're looking at redistricting. At the other end of that, we have the Voting Rights Act that says you have to take race into account. You have to respect the voting interests of the minorities. And we've got some statistics here we'll talk about in a minute. So in balancing this, you have the 14th Amendment, you have the Voting Rights Act, and then we have a set of criteria called traditional redistricting principles. And basically what those are, they're very simple concepts, but you have to make sure that each part of your district is contiguous. You can't split up your district into 2 independent zones, so to speak. Each part of your district has to connect another. You try to make sure your district is as compact as possible. That largely depends upon the population density and how you draw these other maps, but it's kind of the look test when you look at that. If it looks like a district, if it looks more square as opposed to an odd shape, that's the preference. You try to avoid splitting precincts. Ultimately, when people go to vote, you want this to be as simple on the public as possible. And you want to try to avoid splitting precincts. Now, the smaller the area you have, like a town, the more difficult that may be. But you want to make it this administratively simple, and you try to avoid splitting as few precincts as possible. Now, somewhat that's a balancing act with maintaining one person, one vote. You're probably going to have to split some precincts to get that population right, because precincts are not of the same size and they're not always in the right location where you need to draw the lines. The most important thing from the local level is defining what are your core districts and what are your communities of interest. At the state level, we can look at the maps and we can look at statistics and we can look at the census count and we can balance those numbers and we can look at the Voting Rights Act and we can make those judgment calls. But as part of your redistricting principles, it is very important for you to decide what's important in your area. What are the communities of interest? What are the core parts of your district? When we go through these numbers in a minute, you will see that some of your districts going to have to give up people. Some of your districts need to gain people. Well, y'all have to make a decision on what part of your districts need to be given up or where do you need to gain. How do you move those people out, or move those people around, I should say. And that should largely be based on a community of interest. You try not to split, neighborhoods. You try not to split other areas, whether it's a work zone, a business zone, or whatever. We don't have a good feel in Columbia for what that is. So as you go through this, it's important for you to decide as a group what areas, when we start splitting accounts or having to move things around, what makes sense from a community standpoint or from your core district to move those around. So that's a big input there on that. So to go to our report here, just to highlight for you. The town of Hilton Head has grown, or your population change has moved unevenly. On page 3 of our report here, we've got a chart and a graph. You have 2 districts that are below the goal. The goal would be to have approximately 6,277 people in each district. That would be the perfect or ideal district. You have 2 districts, District 4 and 5, that are 9% below. They are about 600 people below that average. So those 2 districts need to pick up 600 people closely thereabouts. Your other districts have too many people. Most notably 1 and 2 and 6. They are over by about 300 to 400 people each. So District 3 is pretty close. You may not have to do much with that. But again, it depends on this overall balance council has to deal with. When you're having to maintain one person, one vote, there's a principle called, or basic concept called deviation.
Frank, I'm gonna just pause you for 1 second. The materials that you sent over earlier this afternoon, we're gonna see if we can throw those up on the screen. That way everybody can take a look at them as you're going through them. I think it's gonna help folks just follow along a little bit easier. So if you bear with us for just about 2 seconds, we're gonna get through the technical capabilities here. We're gonna get this up there. That way, we'll just ask you to kind of go over those again, because those are obviously very important figures and numbers to go over from where we're starting at.
Certainly. Okay.
There we go. Oh, Krista did. Wonderful, Krista.
Man, that's great. Yeah, if you could go to page 3.
Page 3. There. All right.
Okay, page 3.
One more. There you go. Thank you. So we have here the statistics on the left, and we have a bar graph on the right just showing. So if you look at that bar graph there, that red line represents the ideal district based on the new census population of, you won't have about 6,277 people. That's the goal. The gray areas there, those are the 2 districts that are below that goal. You see they're 5672 and 5710. And then you have 4 districts there, 1, 2, 3, and 4 that are above that. So your goal is to minimize that deviation in there. When you look at the table on the left, there's the bottom number in that table is called a range. That's 15.57%. What the courts have said and what state law requires is your deviation between your highest district, which will be District 2, your highest population district, that's 5.93% above the goal, and your lowest populated district, that's District 4, is minus 9.64. If you combine those 2 numbers, disregarding the algebraic sign, you get a range of 15.57%. Your goal is to get below 10%. That is the absolute maximum. Our recommendation is you should go lower, possibly, our recommendation is to a 5% range. So in other words, you'd like to have the highest district no more than about 2.5% over and the lowest district about 2.5% under. But you can go anywhere below 10%. The closer you get to 0, the stronger your plan is. But again, you have to balance the need here for deviation with these other factors. Where, you have to decide, is it more important to have a community, to keep one community larger? Is it better to have a little bit higher or lower deviation there in order to preserve a community, or do you need to split that area? Those are decisions council has to make. I should say for the public, you cannot always respect every community. The lines have to be drawn somewhere. There's no perfect plan. Some community will take priority over another, or some interest will outweigh another. So you can't make everyone happy. It's just the way it works here. I wish it was simple, that we could simply put all these factors in a statistical model and take into account all these factors. And while that can be done mathematically, to me, it's important for this community interest those desires of council and those constituents have to be taken into account. And that's something that can't be done, just mathematically. So it takes a lot of discussion among the council. But again, when you look at that deviation percent, ideally, the goal would be to get somewhere between +2 and +2.5 and -2.5. The state Senate has adopted a 5% deviation standard in its plan. But again, that's a decision council will have to make on which way they want to go. If we can flip over to page 5, 2 more pages. There's a set of tables. Thank you. So this chart starts talking about the racial factors and the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act says you have to give attention to the minority districts, that you have to be careful not to dilute that voting strength or not to pack it all in one area. If you've heard the terms packing or cracking, of putting too many minorities in an area or separating them out of a community to dilute their voting strength. You don't have that much of an issue here given the overall mix of Hilton Head. Your minority community, the Black population is 6.1%. It's highest in District 1. There's not enough of the Black community there to draw a district as far as race is concerned. But as ethnicity is concerned, you have a higher Hispanic population in District 1. Overall, the Hispanic population there you see is 13%. They're a heavier, larger population mix in District 1. So when you look at that, the white population is 40%. That's more of an influence district. The minorities have an opportunity to say that. But under the redistricting principles, the other factor you have to look at is not only the size of this, but do they vote as a block, which it will take some further analysis here to do that. But I don't see a particular area here where you can draw a majority minority districts. You just don't have the population there. They're represented, in District 1, but I don't see a way to make much change of that going forward in that. But that's just something you have to look and be aware of and consider, over time as things change, just to be aware of that. But I don't see this as a borderline issue. We have some cities where the population mix is much more balanced, and you have to look at that more closely. So, and just to explain the table, we had a question last night. The top set of charts is actual population. The bottom chart, that VAP, is voting age population. That's something that we look into when you have to look at the Voting Rights Act, but I don't anticipate that being a prime consideration because of the low minority population in the town here. So on page 6 of 6, it's kind of our conclusion and recommendations. We did try to do, let's talk. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. We're trying to do a voting analysis, but the data at the local level is very sparse and difficult. However, that only comes into a play if we have to look harder than these first 2 steps on the Voting Rights Act. We're attempting to do that. So our recommendation is, as much as is exactly what you're doing today, is that it is best practice for you to have a public hearing to discuss this report and solicit feedback from the public. In my reading of the recent court decisions, the courts very much prefer to have decisions made up front by counsel for y'all to discuss in advance and set your criteria. In the court, again, in the cases I have read, the opinions, the courts kind of frown upon finding a reason after the fact. Should you get sued and want to defend something after the fact, the court doesn't like seeing that after the fact and a reason why you drew it a certain way. So the more discussion you have up front, the more transparent it is, the stronger it builds a record. And again, that's what this whole process is is should you get sued, you're building a record and establishing up front what's important to the council, what's important to the citizenry in adopting this, and what your criteria are. So there's some basic things here. We have some draft resolutions that have been adopted by other counties and cities to help you go through this. But basically, we need you to, basically it's recommended that you adopt an ordinance to say that we're going to adhere to the 14th Amendment and the one person, one vote. You know, we're going to establish a deviation of 5% or 10%, or we're going to go as good as we can, but we're going to make sure it's below 10%, just something to acknowledge that. You need to acknowledge that you're going to look at the Voting Rights Act, and then you have the opportunity here to talk about you want to make sure you minimize the division of voting precincts. You want to make sure things are compact, but especially again, where you can outline and talk about your core district and explain that up front, what's important. So that'll help you get started. There are two ways or a couple of ways we can proceed after this. Our office has created this data, this benchmark file, so to speak. Our office is glad to work with you in drafting a plan. The other extreme of that is we can give the file to your GIS staff and they can work with that and work with you independently, or you can work with it independently and use us as a consultant as you go through this. We are happy to work with you as best we can. I will say that we have 30 counties and 15 cities, plus a couple of school districts and other areas we're working with, and we've got a small staff. So we're not able to provide a lot of one-on-one, hands-on work. We kind of work as the work comes. Our process is we work when the work comes in and then passes it back to y'all for information and ask for feedback. But it's certainly acceptable, and we're actually trying to push this more for the 2030 census to train more staff. So your staff, your GIS staff, can work more directly with you and help you look at options and considerations going through this. So, Mr. Mayor, that is the basic outline. That is the basic statistics and requirements you have. I hope we've been pretty clear with this, but I'm happy to answer any questions to help clarify or cover something we haven't discussed.
Thank you very, very much. We'll start with the questions. Mr. Brown.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the presentation, and thanks, Josh, for getting that up on the screen so we could have some reference. I'm not sure I have a whole lot of questions for what's been put in front of us. My questions are more to us as a group, but I do have one, I guess, I need a little help with. When you describe one person, one vote, I guess I understand that from a overarching concept with our population at 37,661, and you breaking it down divisible by 6. But what I'm not exactly following is when you start to break it down by race and ethnic group, in the lower percentages that are associated with the districts outside of Ward 1.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious to know, I guess, best practice, some examples of how you're still accomplishing. I guess that's a little tricky, trying to accomplish one person, one vote, and also trying to hold together those ethnic or race groups with having a significant amount of percentage within one district.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that a little bit more?
Yes, sir. So on page 5, we'll look at page 5 again. They are two distinct concepts. You've got the 14th Amendment that says one person, one vote, and then you also have the Voting Rights Act. So those are two things that you have to balance. When we look at page 5 there, in that column there is the statistical tables. Let you get to that. Yeah. So you look at District 1 there. If you go over to the column that says percent non-Hispanic DOJ Black, that's the Department of Justice definition of the Black population. District 1 has 21% of its district as the Black population. When you look at the other districts, they're pretty small. They're 2%, 2.9%, 3%, 1%, 4%, overall 6% in the county. There's not an awful lot of Black population in the other parts of the county. So, I mean, that's when you're trying to balancing there. If you had, in some counties, if you had a larger percentage, you may see 30, 40, 50% in one district, or you may see two other districts with 23% each. But you don't have an overall large population to pick or choose from in the other counties. Now, District 1, let me go back to, let me just comment briefly. District 1 has to give up needs to give up around 316 people to get to the ideal. It would be important, from our view, at District 1, not to give up many Black voters out of that district. I think you would kind of want to kind of preserve that area there for that opportunity. You try not to put too many of the Hispanics out of that district either. So basically you're talking about maybe moving more of the white votes in one of the other counties. You don't want to dilute that voting strength to whatever it's there. Now, you don't have a lot of minorities in the district overall, but to what's there, I think it's kind of important not to go backwards in a way. So I don't know, does that answer your question?
Absolutely, that helps. As far as what I was trying to get to was some type of either baseline or best practice when it comes to moving the numbers around, because I understand that we have to make shifts because a couple of districts are over and a couple are under. But how you maintain that one person, one vote, and be able to balance 14th Amendment and Voting Acts Act, I think is important to the discussion. So you reiterated. I got it now. Thank you.
It also just depends on where they're located. You know, if you got a community right there on the border that you're trying to protect, you know, again, when you're trying to draw the lines, it depends on where the people are located. It's all about the facts driving it, and sometimes it's easier than others.
Hold on, before Councilman Ames goes, I think it's worth supplementing with that Councilman Brown, to your concern, when council goes to adopt the resolution outlining the redistricting process, that's one of the principles that they can identify as something that they will be focused on as part of that process and formally incorporated into it from the outset. And then the last comment, and Frank, if you could real quick, because I think you touched on this, but I think it's worth highlighting it again, the fact that you're going to have to work with whole census tracts. Because when you start looking at moving those populations in and out of each district, that's where, you know, I've historically seen people struggle, because when you take a whole census tract, you take everything that comes with it, being population and demographics, and you can't take portions of it. So if you could just touch on that briefly, please.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's actually blocks. Tracts are a broader group, but the census block is the lowest level of detail on which you can use. You cannot split a census block. Census blocks, sometimes they look like a more uniform, like a city block, but in more rural areas, they'll have odd shapes. And we run into difficulty sometimes. People want half of a block. Well, no, you get the whole block or none of it. And then to get to a block that contiguous, sometimes those odd shapes get in the way of things. So that's why, you know, when you start getting in the nitty gritty detail, it's really important. It's really time consuming. It may look fine on a map where you want to go, but once you start looking to see where those where the census blocks are, sometimes that can throw a quirk or throw a wrench in what you're trying to do, and you just have to think. But no, I appreciate your comment up front. That's exactly what you need to do is a council, set the priorities for your council. Things like that is very important.
How many census blocks on Hilton Head?
Great question. We may have to get back to you. I can tell you in the state of South Carolina, there are about 160,000 blocks. So Beaufort County, if you divide that by 46 on average,
I cannot do that math actually.
that's about 40,000 blocks maybe, or 4,000, I don't know, 4,000 blocks. So you probably got a few hundred blocks.
Yeah, and unfortunately, they're not necessarily equally distributed. So you may have a block that has 50 people in one, and you may have one that has 400 in another. And so it's truly on an individual level that you have to look at these pieces. And when you move one, what the ripple effect is everywhere else. And so it takes a while to do. But I will also say this, in looking back at the previous redistricting efforts of the town, I thought it was important to highlight that because we've got a number of very well-defined residential subdivisions on the island, and sometimes those blocks split those districts. They may not be entirely within one area, and that can come as a surprise to some people. So we want to make sure to get that information out to folks in advance of before they start seeing these maps and these changes.
Yeah, just to highlight that a little bit further, the blocks are also used to build your precincts. And so it serves dual purposes. You may have to split precincts, but you're not going to split blocks. So
Perfect.
you're trying to minimize voter disruption. But
Hey, Mr. Ames?
Thank you, Mayor. I would appreciate just having the opportunity to study the presentation that was just given and also have staff provide council with the census block information as a map. The more we can have information on a map, the better off I think I'll be. Appreciate it.
Mr. Hawkins?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A few questions, Frank. The RFA, as I understand it, recommends a deviation range of 5%. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought I heard you set another goal at 2 to 2.5 or 2.25%.
yeah, that is trying to explain when you talk about a range of 5%, that would be a range. Somebody could be 2.5% above and 2.5% below. So your deviation is the total range, which will be 5. But in essence, you're talking about having one district that would be about 2.5% or maybe 3% higher. And then if you have too many, somebody's going to have too few. So somebody else would have to be 2.5% or 2% low. So it's a 5%. It's 5% is the recommendation. You're legally entitled to go up to 10 on that, which would be like a 5 and a 5 for the highest and lowest district.
Okay, so translated that on average, if we're hitting a 5% deviation island-wide, we're pretty much in the ballpark.
Yes, sir.
Correct.
Yeah,
Okay.
District 3 is deviation is 2%. So you're talking about 129 people difference per district.
You mentioned, just to paraphrase, encouraging us to get involved in community awareness, community education. And if that were the pleasure of the mayor and town council to have 1 or 2 or whatever educational sessions for the community, is it your advice that in advance of that, we as a council have achieved the amount of consensus we can before that? Or do we wait on that and go out and communicate this to the community and then come back and internalize our own recommendation among ourselves?
Each town, each county is different. I mean, the goal of this, I think, is education for the public so they understand. You may be enough of a strong community where you understand each other and y'all can get to a consensus. You may need to have some communities maybe not as well informed as others, and you may need to make a better effort to get out and share things. So it's whatever works best with your area. This, I think, is a good start. You've got it broadcast and people understand this. How you solicit input, it's what works well for you. Do they go through your council members? Do you have one? We were in Beaufort County last week, and in Beaufort County was talking about having county hearing throughout the area. Hilton Head's kind of small. I don't know if you just need one or you need to go to both ends of the island. It's kind of whatever suits your needs. You may have input just solicited online. You could ask people to provide their own maps. You may have some good GIS people. It's just whatever kind of works for you and your community.
Okay, thanks. And my last question is this. You're obviously, and I say this respectfully, very fact-driven, very data-driven, so you're as objective as possible. That said, in the last census, it was a troubled time in two respects. One, it was COVID, and secondly, given where we are with immigration law or lack thereof, the odds are that the Spanish population here is quite underreported.
Mm-hmm.
So in a de facto sense, how do we deal with that? You made a point that it's important to start getting all of this in order for the 2030 period. During that time, odds are that our friends in Washington will come to grips with an immigration law, a law that probably recognizes many of the people that are here today. So in effect, we could be right at the cusp of having a new increase in voters in the area, people that are already here but not counted. How do you deal with that?
The court decisions I have read, their opinions, one of the ones that I've read recently, the more recent decisions, they recognize that redistricting is not a perfect, the math is not perfect, the data is not always perfect. They appreciate or knowing that every 10 years you make an effort. They realize the data can be bad. It is the data we're dealt with though. And it's the standard that everybody uses. Everybody's going to use the census data, and we got a lot of communities expressing your same concern that certain areas are undercounted. But the goal is to try to catch up where we are. Going forward, I get a similar question from councils about, well, we got huge developments going on. We know this district's got a new development, it's going to have 2,000 new units here. How do you take that into account? And I kind of say, well, you don't know, you don't have perfect, you're not required to take, by the law, you're not required to take that into account. You may know some of the factors that are going on, but you don't have perfect information about the whole county there. Again, the courts have just realized you have to deal with the information you're giving. You make that best effort to catch up. I have not seen a court wanting to second guess a decision on a council. I don't see a lot of courts wanting to get involved in this. They trust the council, and I think through your deliberations, if you talk about that, then that may be a reason you look at deviation a little bit. Is that a reason there? Because if you think there's an undercount or something like that, maybe if you think there's an undercount, maybe you have a little bit lower deviation in that area because you think there may be more voters. So that's just part of the balancing there. You have to deal with the facts, like you say, we're fact driven. To make assumptions going forward, I just be careful on how much you rely on those assumptions without accurate data going forward.
Thank you.
You're on mute.
Sure, I'm happy to kind of follow up on Councilman Harkin's comments. Staff has outlined kind of proposed next steps forward. So with your indulgence, I'll just kind of go over those real quick and lay out what we would recommend in terms of moving this issue forward. And essentially, we've developed 8 steps. The first would be, now that we have received some benchmark data, the goal would be to continue to get that information out to the public, likely conduct some other kind of public engagement session or meeting so that we can again review that data with the public and solicit direct questions and comments from them on that data. Step 2 would be having town council adopt a formal resolution outlining their redistricting principles. The majority of that would consist of the constitutional principles that Frank outlined in his presentation, along with an identification of your target deviation and your identification of communities of interest that you're desiring to maintain as part of this process. The third would be to ask the Revenue and Fiscal Affairs Office. Frank had kind of outlined 3 different approaches. Our recommendation is kind of go with a hybrid approach. To ask them to kind of prepare a baseline map of redrawn districts, primarily for the knowledge of the fact that their map would meet all of the known and identified constitutional requirements and would be defensible if challenged. But again, to use that as a baseline source of reference, staff would then work individually with members of council to develop alternatives. We would then engage in a second series of public education efforts to present all of the alternatives that may have been developed at that point, as well as soliciting additional comments and feedback from the public on the maps or any changes that may need to be made to those maps. Then we would take all of the information that we had gathered through those public engagement sessions, bring it back to the Finance and Administration Committee for discussion and consideration of selecting a preferred option, and then working through the committee process to bring forward to council a recommendation of the committee on a preferred option for council to consider for adoption.
Thank you. Ms. Becker?
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you for the presentation. I am taking notes because this is my first exposure to this, and I am learning as we go along. This has been tremendously helpful to me, and as I have questions, I will certainly ask them moving along. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Mr. Lennox?
Thank you, John, and thank you, Frank, for the very effective presentation. I'm interested in page 1 of the appendix, which follows the 6 pages that you described. Although there is a modest increase over the 10 years in total population, it's interesting to note the elements that make up that modest increase. 3 are actually declining. The white population, black population, and Hispanic populations are actually in modest decline. Other and multi-race are really driving the increase. Frank, is that something that you typically see, or are we unique?
We're seeing more of this statewide. There's been an increase in the multi-race. I don't know if that's a true population change, or did people classify themselves differently this time in the census, given all the social issues going on. But we have been noticing just statewide that multi-race category has increased, and it's the fastest growing. But whether that's a new population or just a reclassification from 2010, we don't have the data to definitely say that.
Do you think that a municipality should consider trends in its redistricting?
I mean, I think it's one of the factors, yes. I mean, again, it's a factor to be considered like that. But like I say, you don't be careful using, again, sticking to the core principles is the safest thing. You can take into account for trends, but I wouldn't let it outweigh some other more established factor, so to speak.
Okay, good. Thank you, Frank. I appreciate it. I'm sure, like Tammy, there'll be more questions to follow.
Mr. Stanford?
Yes, thank you. Krista, could you bring up that chart that shows the various districts and the breakdown and percentages?
Done by end of February, beginning of March.
That's it. Thank you. I want to echo what my colleagues have said. Frank, this is really educational to us. I have never been through this exercise before either. And I think your expertise is going to be truly vital to us. A few minutes ago, you were able to look at this chart and determine the number of people that need to be moved around. How does one, I don't see that in this chart, I don't think. So can you explain that to me?
Yeah, if you go to page 3, it's the 2 pages before this one.
Yes.
There it is. So your ideal population, if you take your new census count and divide it by your number of districts, your ideal is that goal there of 6,277. And then we're showing you the actual census counts there. We have to get District 1 needs to give up 316 people. We don't have a map for you yet. Where are you going to give up those 316 people? Do you just shift the line up wherever the map is on District 1? Do you just shift the line over a little bit? Do you shift the top half of the line, the bottom half of the line? It's part of that consideration, and that's where you have to really understand is you're having to move district people out of that district. How do you preserve the core of District 1? Where does it make more sense to move, to take people out of District 1 and move them in there? I know we have a map in here showing where districts 4 and 5 are. There at the bottom, if I'm looking at the map, yeah, districts 4 and 5 have to pick up people. Well, naturally, it makes sense to move those from the adjoining districts. So how do you do that? Like District 3's in the middle there, looks like between 3 and 4. How do you start moving those blocks around? So it's somewhat of a domino effect. Once you make one change, how do you affect the other? In looking at this, I think the key, it's easier to start, which districts have to give up where those populations, like for example, on the hill there of the boot, it'd be hard to move that hill by itself because it's so situated within the middle of another district. But again, when you look at all these factors, when you look at the blocks to see where the population is, when you look at your communities, you have to kind of figure out what makes sense or what part of these districts need to be moved. And that's the information that your call, I don't think it's you or one of your colleagues requested about block level detail about, well, how many people are along this edge, or where's the bulk of the biggest, where the biggest blocks, where the bulk of the population. So that's where it really just takes some time and analysis for you to understand what you feel good about realigning these districts. Again, we can make the numbers work real easy, but it's important for your community to stay intact as you define that community.
Okay, that's very useful. And if I understand what you're saying, you're going to provide us with some initial guidance about, that is maps that show census blocks and where you might suggest that we would make adjustments to get it properly balanced. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. That was a request. We're working to provide it for all the counties and hope to have that soon, but you'll be able to look by county to see the blocks in your districts, and you kind of see where the population is, how many people, white, black, Hispanic, or whatever. Being able to show that on a graph gets a little bit more difficult, but we're providing that information so as you learn and you can kind of consider all these factors. So it's just a labor intensive process, but we're going to get there. It may take us another week, but we'll be there.
I'm very pleased that we have such expertise there that can move that process forward and make those suggestions to us, because it looks like a very complex process, frankly, much more complicated than I ever thought it was going to be, given the very small change in our overall population, but we will work our way through that. I guess my final question is timing on this. Do we have a deadline, a line in the dirt we have to meet?
When does filing open for your next election?
Yeah. So, and Councilman Stanford, to that point, we've kind of established a recommended timeline working backwards from that date. So our next general election is November of 2022. The ballots have to be finalized by August 15th. The filing period correspondingly closes the end of July. We'd like to give the community and the public at least several months advance notice of knowledge of what those new districts are. So again, working backwards from that timeline, our target goal is to have the new maps adopted sometime in the end of February, beginning of March timeframe.
That sounds like a perfectly rational approach, and it's taken into account the various dates that I was not aware of for sure. So I look forward to getting more familiar with this and seeing these maps that break this down into those census blocks so that we can see what the pieces are that we have to move around. So I look forward to the exercise, and I thank you again for sharing your expertise. That's it, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Can we go to citizens? What do we have today?
Mr. Mayor, could I ask one other question?
Sure.
Yeah, this is to Frank. It's probably a silly question, but you know, we pride ourselves with the goal of trying to be one community. And when we look how we're divided up into PUDs, we've inherently designed little buckets of isolation. If it were the pleasure of the community to get rid of all of these districts on this small piece of geography and just transform our town into a at-large community, what would your thoughts be?
You asking me?
Yes, Frank.
Yeah.
Again, it's probably not a very serious discussion, but.
Well, I mean, that's a process. I mean, I don't know much about, except I know you'd have to have a referendum to put that before the community out there. I would say just generally any form of government has its strengths and weaknesses. If you look at statewide, you know, we have some counties that are statewide. I think Jasper County, countywide. I think Jasper County, they're at large, but they have residency requirements where people have to be elected from a particular area in the county, but everybody gets to vote on it. So there are multiple ways to do this. And I think it's just, you know, it just kind of is whatever is best for your community and your makeup. We got a lot of different forms in South Carolina, and each one's tailored to what makes sense. We got some counties that have 11 members. Some counties have 5 members. And so there is no uniform sense. I think it's whatever makes sense for your community.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, let me open up now to public comment. Before we take public comment, I'd like to remind our citizens of the town's rules and procedures for taking public comments. Each citizen will have 3 minutes to address the committee. At the end of the 3 minutes, you'll hear a beep. Please maintain a decor suitable for this meeting. Kristen?
Thank you, Mayor McCann. Citizens could submit electronic comments on the agenda item listed on today's agenda via the town's open town hall portal. The portal closed this afternoon at 12 p.m. and the report was sent to you and town council shortly thereafter the closing time. In addition to submitting comments on the portal, citizens were provided the opportunity to sign up to call into the meeting and address council during the meeting. Today, we have 2 citizens signed up to speak, the first being Ms. Patsy Bryson. Ms. Bryson?
Yes, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Please proceed.
Thank you. Patsy Bryson speaking on behalf of the Coalition of Island Neighbors, or COIN. COIN has been following and studying the redistricting process for several months, including listening to the presentation by the South Carolina office to Beaufort County earlier this year. COIN greatly respects the expertise of the South Carolina Office of Revenue and Fiscal Affairs. And most notably, we appreciate the recommendation of no more than a 5% deviation rather than 10% as shown in the materials previous to this meeting. Nonetheless, we recommend a different type of public input process, and we have provided the town council members with our recommended proposal. This proposal comes from study and working with other groups with whom the coalition is allied, and looking at ensuring public input, especially since we are going to need to look at communities of interest and changing the ward boundaries, and it may affect almost all of the awards, all of the awards based upon the data presented today. We have a couple of concerns. One is that this is primarily staff-driven. It should be driven by the public, with the town council making the final decision. In addition, the individual meetings with town council members is of public concern as well. The process should be open and transparent as possible. In this case, because it involves voting rights, it must be absolutely public and transparent. My colleague, Risa Schraden-Prince, will talk a little bit about the history of the public involvement in the previous census data redistricting efforts. But suffice it to say, there has been more public involvement, and the educational process is different from actually having input by the public. We recommend that a task force of public members be established to assist the town council with the redistricting process. We propose a task force of 7 members with 2 alternates and include representatives from the League of Women Voters, the Native Island Business and Community Affairs Association, property owners associations, as we have across the island, the Greater Island Council, the Latinx community, the Hilton Head Bluffton Chamber of Commerce, and a representative from COIN, the Coalition of Island Neighbors. We believe we have set forth a proposed timeline. In addition to that, again, as described at this meeting, working backwards from the election next year to include the filing time period so that maps can be set out well ahead of the filing time period. And we urge your adoption of the task force that we have recommended and the process that we have recommended, and we appreciate your time.
Thank you, Ms. Bryson. Sir, our last citizen is Risa Prince. Ms. Prince?
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'm also following Patsy's comments and representing COIN. Since the town was established, redistricting has always included a public advisory group to make recommendations to town council. I have spoken to participants in those groups, and they acknowledged how important it was to recognize that no one knows our neighborhoods and communities of interest as well as the residents do, especially given constraints with our unique pre-existing PUDs and historic neighborhoods. The concept of actually sitting down and going through this on a census block by census block change, moving one from a ward to an adjoining ward, is going to be tedious, and that's what these advisory group members told me. My question today is, does town council or even town staff have the capacity to do this at that granular level? And wouldn't it be more effective to take volunteer members of the public who are willing to put the time in to come up with the initial proposal to take back to town council? Knowing the depth of analysis required to make this a legal, sound, and supportable process, that's the genesis of our recommendation from COIN to establish the task force comprised of citizens. Thanks for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, Ms. Prince. Sir, that concludes appearance by citizens.
Does anybody have one last question for Frank? Alex?
No, I don't have a question for Frank. I've got a question for Mr. Orlando. If you're waiting, I can wait. If you want to let Frank go, I'm not sure what the next steps are.
No, go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, so I tried to jot down what Mr. Gruber was describing as the 8 steps that they're proposing to us. Are you looking for us to give that an approval,
Mr. Brown, not so much an approval, just as a de facto approval today. I'm not asking for your vote on that process. We have some work to do. I think today's the first step. Receiving the benchmark report is an important first step, just to start getting our own heads around the work to do. We can, over the next little bit, refine what the process looks like. We heard from Ms. Bryson and Ms. Prince today. I received the email, heard from all of you. Let's refine the expectation. Let me think about it a little bit, make some more recommendations and talk with all of you to refine what this process is. It's going to be open. It's going to be public. We, of course, have some work to do as we look through our numbers, the base data provided by the state, the assessment and analysis provided by our professional geographic information system employees. So they have some work to do, but please know, Mayor, Council, and others, every step along the way will be a public step. Let me think about the process a little more. I completely agree with what Josh is saying. I don't know if things are being taken out of context to think that we are going to be doing this work in-house and just making a representation or a recommendation, right? The difference between public education, I do understand, is different than public input. So bear with us as we launch. Today's a kickoff meeting.
I'm glad you made that distinction at the end there, Mr. Orlando, the difference between recommendations and education. I, for one, have learned a heck of a lot today just by listening, okay? And the fact that it is going to be a very tedious process. And although I'd like to claim myself as an on-the-ground expert when it comes to where certain race groups, ethnic groups, PUDs, and that sort of thing, and where the streets separate our current lines, the fact that we do have to do so much shifting, even though we don't have a big shift in overall population, I think some quote unquote local experts will definitely help us through this process where they have the chance to become intimately involved because no one knows a property owners association better than a member. Okay. And I think we've got the technical piece that the Fiscal Affairs Committee can help us with. We got internally with our staff some GIS capabilities and that sort of thing. But boots on the ground, I think it's going to what's going to get us to a place where we're going to be absolutely comfortable with what we're putting forward, and of course making sure that it's going to hold up the test of the court. So those are just my thoughts on it. Thank you.
Are there any other questions for Frank?
Yeah, I do have one. Just by way of information, Frank, what was Hilton Head's population 10 years ago?
Hey, I'm not sure I have that.
All right.
Hang on. It's on that graph, I think. No, I don't have it totaled for you. I mean, I've got.
All right. No, that's all right. I thought if you had it handy, that'd be good. And Mayor and Mark, when can we on council and the public expect to see census block data, maps, current districts, ward lines, and so on, just as base information?
We'll look at for the first week in December. David will put the information out.
Thank you.
Tammy?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, I was looking for it, and I may not be finding it, or I may not have it. The presentation today that was given, Frank's presentation, do we have a copy of that? Is it in an email and I'm just not finding it?
You do, and I know Frank and his team are working hard for us. We received it right before our meeting today. As we kicked the meeting off, out of the corner of her eye, Krista was emailing that to you.
Okay, thank you. I know I emailed her, I'm sorry, saying, where is it? I can't find it. Thank you all. I appreciate that.
Once we end our meeting and you checked your emails, it should be in there. Please let me know if it's not.
And David, the 10-year ago number was 37,099.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Any other questions for Frank? Frank, I'm gonna thank you. Frank, you have a closing question for Frank?
I have a closing request.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Just wanted to share with you, I'm gonna be in Hilton Head next week. My daughter is getting married down there. And I'd just like to ask town council to make sure you got great weather for our wedding.
Done, Frank, done.
Welcome to Hilton Head.
I thank you all very much for coming today. Great presentation. Have a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All in
Second.
favor, raise your right hand. Thank you very much.